What's up, Crossbridge Brickell? We are now at our next teaching for our community group leaders. We've been going through the blessing as a teaching tool, and now we end up at the G, the last letter, and we're going to talk today about growing an apprentice. Now, growing an apprentice is really a shorthand for the subject of multiplication. It is birthed out of the conviction that healthy families always reproduce. Just imagine if you are a parent and you have your kids are getting older, they're a 35-year-old son. He's still in his Star Wars PJs. He's playing video games in the basement. I don't know if there's basements in Miami, but he's still in the house playing video games, doesn't have a job. He just hasn't left. We would not consider that a very healthy family dynamic, would we? And so in the same sense, healthy families are always looking to send their children out into the world to flourish. And in the same way, we see our community groups as these families. We see this all throughout Scripture, from creation to the call of Abraham, even to Jesus. We see multiplication is assumed all throughout the narrative. In the beginning, God tells Adam to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We also see that with Abraham, he said, I will bless you and make you into a great nation so that you'll be a blessing. And making into a great nation means that they will multiply and become numerous in the land. And also Jesus says, therefore, go and make disciples into all the nations. It's assumed that we're making disciples, we're multiplying as we go. So, and Paul puts it this way in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, he says this, what you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will also be able to teach others also. You see 4 generations in this text. You see Paul, Timothy, faithful men, and the others. And it's just assumed all throughout Scripture. So that is a very necessary component of our community groups. How do we multiply our community groups? There's various ways in which you can do multiplication, but at Crossbridge Brickell, we're going to encourage you to do one way. And this way is to train and send out an apprentice. And with this model in mind, there are 4 stages for this multiplication. The first is plan for multiplication. Second, select an apprentice. Third, train your apprentice. And fourth, send out your apprentice. Today, right now, we're just going to talk about the first 2, planning and selecting. So let's first talk about plan for multiplication. Now, as early as possible, you want to begin telling your community group that you are planning on multiplying your group. Please, please, please do not use a language of divide or separating. Language is crucial here. We're multiplying. This is a very difficult process. And if we don't mention it up front, it probably will not happen, at least not intentionally. And if we use language of separation and of division, then it makes the process more painful. Now, in your covenant, you've already set a target date for multiplication. Always keep that date in front of your group, especially in your prayer times. This next year, when we go through the covenant process, we're going to include the name of the apprentice that you will be training this next year. So that's the first step, plan for multiplication. Now, the next step is selecting an apprentice. And I think this might be the hardest step in the multiplication process, finding the right person. So let me share with you a few key principles that we find in Scripture that will help you select your apprentice. And the first is this: be with people, your people of your community group, and minister to them. Jesus did not rush into his selection process. Many people don't know this, but Jesus spent more than a year with ministering to the crowds before he selected his 12. And we see his selection happen early on in the Gospels, but that doesn't mean it happened early on in his ministry. It happened a little bit after the first year. So if possible, it's best to have multiple interactions with potential future leaders and get a good picture of where they are spiritually. The next principle that we learn from Jesus is pray, pray, pray. Jesus spent a whole night in prayer before he selected his apostles. It is likely that Jesus was praying to his Father about men that he had spent with his last year with. He was asking, God, what do you want me to do with John and James and Simon? He may have prayed through other names that we don't know about. In the night of prayer, the Father confirmed to the Son whom he shall challenge to be apostles. So we see that Jesus' method was informally spending time with the many, and through prayer, he formally called a few to himself so he can prepare them and send them out. So the principle of this selection process can be summarized by saying prayer is foundational to the selection process. Now, the third principle is trust God's sovereignty to show you the people to invest in. The night in which Jesus was betrayed, he spent a lot of time in prayer, and we see some of that prayer in John 17. And in verse 6, Jesus said this, I've manifested your name to the people whom you give me out of the world. So we see Jesus trusting in his Father's sovereignty in whom he should invest his life in. The principle of selection emerges from this passage, which we can put it this way. We must trust God's sovereignty to invest in the people he has given us. The last principle that we learn from Jesus is look for someone who fits the bill. Jesus had a clear idea of who he wanted to follow him. He took time in his selection process, and so should you. To help you in the selection process, Pastor Carter has developed requirements and qualities for each community group leader. We're not going to include them in this video, but I'll include them in the show notes and on Basecamp, so please read those before we get to our next Zoom call. Now, in conclusion, this doesn't mean that the person that you have in mind has arrived or is so spiritually mature. We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for direction in these qualities and requirements. Also, I want to mention that this is not just for men. This is for men or women. And once you have this person in mind, you can start to cast vision into the life. Because our prayer is that by next fall, you will have clearly in your mind who you will include into your covenant, who will be your apprentice. If you would like some additional coaching around this matter on how to cast vision and talk to them, I'll be happy to help you in any way. Now, one final warning before we close. Don't cut corners on this process. You will regret it later. So begin now to pray and trust in God's sovereignty, who has led you to the person that you may invest in. Thank you for listening. I look forward to our conversation. I have some questions in the show notes. Please read through those. If you have questions, please bring them, or you can text me and we can address them at our call. I look forward to talking with you soon, and have a great day.